Hey Jordan, this is Amanda. I want to let you know we are ready on eScribe and YouTube.
Great, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. I will call the Land Use and Planning Committee for July 21st to order. This is probably one of our last purely virtual Land Use and Planning Committee meetings. So most of you know the drill by now, but in case you've been under a rock for the last 15 months. This is a virtual meeting, and we are meeting on the Zoom platform. You can join us live in the meeting at ci.missoula.mt.us/webcasts. And from there, you'll find a link to join the live meeting. You can, when you're in the Zoom meeting, raise your hand using the hand raise function if you want to give public comment. And if you're joining us by phone, you can press *9 on your phone to indicate that you want to provide public comment. You can also call and leave us a voicemail at 406-552-6012. And as always, by email at council@ci.missoula.mt.us. Our first item is roll call. Amanda, could you call the roll for us, please?
Yes, let me get my roll up. Anderson? Absent. Becerra?
Present.
Contos?
Here.
Harp?
Here.
Hess?
Present.
Jones?
I believe she'll be joining us here in just a moment.
Okay. Merritt?
Present.
Ramos?
Present.
Cheryl?
Present.
Basika?
Present.
Von Lossberg? Absent. And West?
Present.
All right. Thank you. We have minutes from June 23rd. Are there any changes to those minutes? Seeing none, those will be approved. I'll note for the record that there are no members of the public in attendance, so no public comment. We have two regular agenda items. The first is a reappointment to the City Board of Adjustment. This is a mayoral appointment. Mayor Engen is not able to join us today, but I know Dale is here if there's any questions or anything. I'd entertain a motion on the appointment. Amber.
Yeah, thanks. I'd be happy to make that motion. And as I said in the interviews earlier, I'm just really thankful for engaged citizens that are willing to act in these capacities.
Great, thanks. The motion is in order. Is there any discussion? Heather.
Thanks, Jordan. I would add that the candidates that we see that were proposed by the mayor they really represent a very wide swath of our community, and I'm supportive of that slate of candidates.
Great, thank you. And again, for the record, there's no public to comment. Any additional discussion? Okay, we can have a roll call vote on the Board of Adjustment appointments.
Becerra,
Yes.
Contos,
Yes.
Harp,
Yes.
Hess,
Yes.
Merritt,
Yes.
Ramos,
Yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
Basika,
Yes.
and West.
Yes.
All right,
Okay,
9 yeses, 0 nos, 0 abstains, 2 absent.
great. So we can go ahead and put that on our consent agenda. Thanks. And our second item is about upcoming proposed comprehensive code reform process. And we have a variety of folks here to walk us through that proposal. And I'll turn it over to Erin Panda for an introduction.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Erin Pahan with Community Planning, Development, and Innovation. We are thrilled to be here this afternoon to talk to you about a path for comprehensive code reform in our community. Missoula is growing, and the city is working hard to adapt to that change to ensure that we're promoting growth that is equitable and sustainable. Many barriers stand in our way to that. Some of these are out of our direct control, and we hear about these on a regular basis in our office, as do you on council floor. These include things like supply chain issues, supply costs, the availability of labor in key trades, and of course, a global pandemic. Some things are well within our control, things like the administrative processes we engage in around development review, recruiting and retaining skilled professionals that we need to do this work, and ensuring that our code provides us the tools that we need to achieve our goals. We've been before council in recent weeks outlining our strategies and the resulting outcomes surrounding process improvements and increased capacity. That work is well underway, and we've got some really exciting numbers to share with council during our August 4th budget presentation. It's clear based on those numbers that we are on the right track. We're here today to begin a community conversation around comprehensive code reform, another element in that development review capacity plan that we shared with you a while back. Since I joined CPDI in November of last year, rarely have I had a conversation with a resident, a developer, or a contractor, or a team member that hasn't led to code reform. Whether it's a resident of Central Missoula or the North Side, rightly concerned about equitable distribution of more compact development in our community, or a developer who is taking a huge financial risk to rezone a property to a designation our growth policy already recommends, or a team member frustrated by the conflicts between our various codes, trying to determine which code should take priority in each specific situations. and how to maintain consistency with inconsistent guidelines. These conversations are happening at all levels, and each Wednesday afternoon and Monday night on council floor as well. So I know you're all intimately aware of the conflicts in our code and our lack of effective tools through which to achieve our goals. The path that Lavelle Means and Ben Brewer will present today will help us meet this challenge, a challenge that will require us not to just be looking at regulation and code, but also to have careful and difficult conversations about the urgent needs that our community faces, our values, our sense of place, and our commitments to making sure Missoula is a place where everyone has an opportunity to thrive. The great news is that we know the city is up to the challenge. CPDI was created under the express mission of promoting equitable development in a resilient, sustainable community. Our recent realignment moved key services and initiatives like community planning, land use, housing and homelessness, the Office of Neighborhoods, and climate action under one roof with the knowledge of how urgent and necessary a comprehensive effort around code reform is. And with the knowledge of how integrated our approach will need to be to achieve success. Our newly adopted functional work team structure in the city of Missoula will ensure that other key departments like Public Works, Parks, Fire, MRA, to name a few, are front and center in the work as well. We also know that the community is up to the challenge. Neighborhoods are doing the work and having hard conversations at a neighborhood level. They're defining what's important to them, how they can contribute to urgent needs like housing and sustainability. Community efforts around equity, health, and climate action are also providing us data and stakeholder engagement that we'll need to align our voices and our goals in these areas. Lavelle Means and Ben Brewer are going to walk us through what we believe to be the best path forward for this work. What we're presenting today is just that, a path. This work's going to need careful consideration by stakeholders across the community and constant, meaningful engagement throughout the process. Also in the meeting today, I want to note are Walter Vanziger, our Deputy Director of Development Services, and Mary McCrae, our Land Use Planning Manager, both of whom will be key leaders in our code reform efforts, along with our community planning team, which you'll hear directly from today. So with that, I will turn it over to Lavelle and Ben.
There we go. Thank you. This is Lavelle Means with the Community Planning section and the Manager of Community Planning. We are really excited and thankful to be describing this potential process to you today, and appreciate Erin's guidance throughout this process. What we want to do today is forward the slides. I'll try it a different way. Okay, hang on, I'm sorry. I was having this issue yesterday too. This is bizarre.
Lavelle, would it be helpful if you stop sharing and Ben pulls up the slideshow and we can tackle it that way?
I'm just going to go to mute for a second, and Ben is here, so just a second.
Just click anywhere on the screen.
I'm trying to do that.
Not on the blue one, but in the,
This.
just to your left screen, just anywhere. So put down, like move your mouse down, just the screen, not the blue part.
I went to too big of a screen, I think. Just a second.
No, because you're in a different window. So if you
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Just think there.
And do you want to just come over here?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, just something. That's all right.
How'd you do that?
That
What?
should work with the arrows.
That should work now. And I could not mute that either. Sorry about that. He says I should be able to use my arrows now. So what we want to do today is describe why this project is needed. And then we're going to do that through framing some problems that we've observed. We will also spend some time talking about some of the research that we've been doing regarding some of the specific tools you're going to be hearing about. And then go through a path for conducting this comprehensive process that we've been exploring, and have time for discussions and questions from you. So first off, in framing the problem, we are starting with the baseline of our department's mission. We have also, so from there, we've developed a summary of several problem statements and are establishing some points from those about those issues and describing the need for this project. So to start with, we are aware that the development code has generated concerns for how they may hinder the city's mission. The current code does not provide the tools needed to cohesively act on the goals of the city's growth policy. The growth policy was adopted in 2015, and the zoning code was adopted. The rewrite that we did comprehensively is over a decade old, and that was back towards the end of 2000. So it makes sense that one is out of sync with the other. We have been doing incremental updates. That was our commitment all along, and we have been doing those to be responsive to issues as they come up. But that's been in a piecemeal approach. And when you imagine that's been happening for year upon year upon year, you start to lose sight of the broader mission. And that is why being able to step back and look at this from a comprehensive perspective helps to make sense. And we now have guidance of the growth policy to include within it. New regulations have also come on board from the growth of other divisions and from the need of other development regulations that we've added since the code in the the late 2000s. So that is, the reason we need to look at how do those regulations speak to each other more, and where do we have conflicts within those regulations, and focus on that alignment. So a comprehensive review and modernization of our regulations is needed to achieve our land use policies. We recognize there has also been growing community concerns and frustrations about development projects. Community members are concerned with community and personal impacts and the inequitable distribution of housing development. Developers have voiced frustrations over lack of regulatory clarity and the length of review times. And city staff and officials note that there's been a lack of alignment between regulations and policies. And certainly, despite our ongoing and increasing efforts due to rapidly increasing costs of housing, housing is still unavailable to many in our community. Recent efforts that you're familiar with regarding developing new projects often come with the request to customize some of that zoning. You start to see projects that require a neighborhood character overlay, or the need for a PUD sitting on top of the project because our regulations are not as up to date as we would like them to be. That's a real strong indicator that the zoning needs to be updated. Also, processes have continually become more complex. updating the code and streamlining process can help to reduce the cost of new housing. A comprehensive community approach is needed to identify an equitable way of increasing housing supply. And then, while needing to address immediate issues of housing supply, we should continue to maintain the high quality of life Missoula values. So this isn't a project about removing regulations entirely, but being able to right-size them for our needs and our values within our community. Regulations that can better support new, equitable, and sustainable housing supply is urgently needed. And that's what we're really trying to strive for. And a comprehensive approach, like we are hoping to be able to do, helps to get us on track in a more timely way, and before the goalpost keeps moving, if you will.
Lavelle, do you want to take questions throughout the presentation, or would you like to wait till the end?
I think it would be great to work through the presentation and then open it up for the questions and discussion.
Okay, that sounds great. And just while I'm talking, note for the record that Gwen Jones joined us about 10 minutes ago. So go ahead.
Thank you. A key to planning this project and the process is to reflect on our policies, our framework, and other research that you've seen and heard about as well. The growth policy is our North Star for policy direction. The growth policy speaks to code reform in several chapters and has a section dedicated to action items that is related to regulation amendments. A summary of actions are highlighted here, which really focus on the need to provide more options within our regulations, the need to look at our zoning districts, and potentially even rezone our land to be up to date on meeting the policies and the values and mission for our community. More specifically, the strategic framework identifies some specific actions to consider now. And that includes establishing shared design standards between our many infrastructures, the need to amend and align our development regulations, the need to address and implement our housing policy through amended codes, and to actually specifically conduct a zoning audit. And then more recently, we also worked on the city subdivision and TED regulation review project. And a result of that was to develop a recommendations report. This came out towards the end of December. And there were key priorities that were established in it, really focusing on addressing consistency, clarity, alignment, and that balance of our many policy statements. There were some priority actions that were included in that recommendations report. And to name a few here are the need to consider and adopt a unified development ordinance, which is a way to pull all of your land development regulations together into one place so that you can look for that consistency and clarity. So that's a key component of what we're trying to further in this process. To continue to look at ways to incentivize the affordable housing, establishing expedited reviews where we can, and aligning our regulations to policy. So there's an aspect of knowing that this goes between policy, code, and policy. So with that foundation in mind, over the last several months, we've been spending time on evaluating and researching what some of those tools mean. And specifically our section, Ben Brewer and Neil in our section, they researched what it means to do a zoning audit. What does a zoning audit look like? What does an audit look like? What do we mean by a UDO? And what are the benefits of it? What are the pitfalls? What are the takeaways on it, as well as a zoning tool you hear a lot about that has to do with modernizing, which is a form-based code. So they did research on those components, and using that information, we've been able to then put a path together, a process together that weaves some of that into something comprehensive. So first off, I'm going to hand this over to Ben, and he's going to go through those 3 key tools and talk about some key takeaways. And then I will come back to talking about our process. So Ben, take it away.
All right, thanks, Laval. This is Ben Brewer with CPDI, and just to go back over what we were asked to research and look into for this project. Initially, again, it was as the initial conversations were beginning about an idea of comprehensive code reform and big solutions to big problems. These were kind of the 3 approaches that we were asked to review, which included an audit, a unified development code, and form-based codes. And we spent time looking into and researching, what are the best practices for these approaches to land use reform. And so we looked at the how and the why and the what and the when and what, as Laval said, what are the pitfalls and the takeaways. We also looked at examples from other places, both in Montana, regionally, and around the country, and looked at how these were being used in those places and what was involved with establishing them and setting them up and how they were working, and got feedback from some of those places as well. And then we also conducted some interviews with some of the consultants that have worked here in Missoula who work in this field and who are very familiar and have a lot of experience with these kinds of tools and the processes.
Ben, your audio is a little weak.
All right, is that any better if I move?
That's a lot better. Yep. Thanks.
Okay, that's all it took. All right. Thank you. So yeah, just to say, we looked at best practices, examples from other places, and we interviewed some of the consultants that have worked on projects here in Missoula who have a lot of experience with these types of tools. So I'm just going to go through kind of a run through of what these are, what the general definitions are, and then our main takeaways, and then we have some final considerations for you from what came out of this research. So I'll start with an audit. The audit and an audit process are basically inspections or investigations of an organization's policies, processes, and procedures. A lot of people, when they hear the term audit, can assume it's a financial thing or concerned with financial analysis. That's not the case when we talk about a land use audit. Basically, we're trying to identify what we don't know, and you're talking about basically scoring or analyzing or reviewing something like your codes based on the criteria that we want them to be evaluated on. So in our case, probably are they meeting our community visions and our policy goals? So audits come in a lot of shapes and sizes. There's a lot of variation in what's entailed in an audit, and they can be specifically focused on zoning, or they can incorporate even more than that, or development codes at large, or specific aspects of those codes. So the scope of the audit is really determined by the client, and that's something that we would need to identify and determine before we began the audit process, if we were to do that. Audits are meant to really focus on what are your issues and challenges. We were cautioned, not to assume any solutions as part of the audit process. That's something that you want to discuss and vet afterwards. Audits are especially helpful at identifying what is missing, or what you can do without in your codes. And they give staff a forum and allow the community to become aware, of what the issues and challenges are. We received some feedback that it would be helpful for Missoula to do a process audit as well, or consider a process audit. And audits provide an important, informed first step towards determining the magnitude of the problem. So it's really, you know, as we move forward with this, we want to move forward with eyes wide open. We want to know what we're solving for and what the challenges are. Thanks, Val. So a unified development ordinance is a comprehensive statute that locate development and land use regulations all in one place and help to eliminate the inconsistencies that exist when regulations are spread across multiple codes. So we talk a lot about the idea of syncing up the codes, and as we talked about already, we've received feedback that codes in Missoula are can be challenging or unclear or not synced up or don't hold hands, and that's really the main goal of a unified development ordinance, is to put everything in one place, use the same terms, use the same processes, have the definitions be consistent throughout, and so that it creates a streamlined, a clear pipeline for development review and understanding what are the rules. So UDOs are very effective at cleaning up existing development regulations. 2 years is a typical time frame for adoption of a UDO. Depending on the scale of the project, that can vary, of course, but that's a general timeline, and that's just to say that that's an indication that a UDO is no small thing, no small undertaking. Just a UDO in itself is a fairly big project to consider. The scope of a UDO can vary from being focused on just cleaning existing codes or to being one component of a larger zoning rewrite or reform. And UDOs can include, it can really vary what codes are included in it. It could be include subdivision and zoning. It could include road standards, parkland requirements, stormwater standards, and so on and so forth. More than one approach is possible in terms of setting the order for cleanup versus innovation and development codes. So the approach that you want to take should be balanced with considerations about political will and acceptable timelines and how much innovation we're considering folding into something like a UDO. And then just a final cautionary word that again we received, especially through interviews, was that a UDO alone won't solve all issues, and it's not a silver bullet, so to speak. It still requires maintenance and implementation and communication and those types of things to make them work well. A form-based code, this is the final kind of component of what we researched when we were considering what might go into something like this code reform project, is basically a land development regulation that uses the physical form of development rather than the separation of uses as the organizing principle for the code. We're all much more familiar with form-based codes after having gone through the SWIP-to-CANE planning process and adopting that form-based code for that area. Well, basically, form-based codes are becoming more common and more popular, and they kind of serve as a course correction, so to speak, for the last century or so of the typical approach to zoning that we've had in this country, that really focuses especially on uses and separation of those uses, and it's gotten kind of more and more intricate in how it does that. So form-based codes are best the best used for preserving or transitioning existing neighborhoods, or for the concept of gentle infill, which is kind of another term that can be used for what we talk about a lot, which is the missing middle housing concept. Form-based codes can be applied to an entire place. They can be citywide, or they can be selectively applied in discrete areas, like we did in SWIP-to-CANE. Cautionary comment that we received about that is that there is a risk to having a patchwork of different form-based codes for too many different codes that are not necessarily using the same rules and terms and processes. if it's not prescribed, and if form-based code may not achieve what we want. So for example, if a goal is to address our housing shortage and infill development, and the goal is to lead to more housing on the ground, if it's not explicitly required, it may not actually achieve that. And then something to consider as well is that form-based codes they're heavily reliant on sound planning in advance of adopting the code. So there's a substantial planning effort and process that would go into laying the groundwork and the foundation, something that's called these regulating plans, to set the basis for the final or the eventual code. And then just something to consider as well is that if in these transitions from Euclidean typical zoning to form-based codes, the conversation about density is a big change for the community often, and can be a difficult conversation to have. And just we'll move on to the final, or my final slide at least. These are kind of what we tried to bring all of this together and give some general ideas to consider for if one or some or all of these were to be incorporated into something like a comprehensive code reform project. So I'll walk through these and hand it back to Lavelle here. We want to know what we're solving for, and that's the goal of the audit. And then from there, we want to identify our solutions. Planning and code are interrelated, and our focus here is on code and how it's implementing policy, but there is a interrelatedness between the two. One informs the other and vice versa. So we want to keep that in mind. We want to not, or we don't want to lose sight of the urgency of our issues, which we have now. We have had already for some time now. So there are there's utility to this comprehensive approach, but we don't want to lose track of what we can do in the near term as well. For example, we want to continue to address our time-sensitive projects like the housing incentives program and the subdivision regulations updates and work like that. We've heard and we're have indications that we're ready to get going on at least a basic unified development ordinance, and the need has already been identified. A final takeaway from form-based codes is that given our interviews at least and talking to professionals in the field, the general sense was that a form-based code, a citywide form-based code, probably doesn't make sense for Missoula. Maybe something more like a hybrid code or some individual discrete areas. We received some guidance on balancing on what the political considerations are for pursuing something like this, and to balance the big innovations with political realism, and kind of finding that balance between trying to do it all and move incrementally, and there are risks towards achieving what we want to do on both sides of that. We want to not rush the process and exercise patience so that and the wait can be the final product can be worth the wait. And we want to ensure that we have staff capacity for the work that we're taking on. And finally, staff and community engagement before and throughout the process is really key. So those are the final considerations that I wanted to leave you with, and I'll pass it back to Lavelle here.
Thank you. So we've taken that research into consideration, and we're using the framing as a foundation for the potential path forward. I'd like to start with describing this potential path by focusing in on our considerations for community engagement throughout the path. We're picturing a robust process with varied ways for the community to participate, including kickoff presentations and participation, listening sessions, likely some small group focused work, and ways to engage online. But we're really early in this process, so we will be developing a more detailed community engagement and communications plan to help set up expectations for our consultant services and our process overall in the next while. But it's an engagement, a robust engagement process that will extend through the several years that we're anticipating this project to take. We know it's important to tackle this project in a way that continually gets tools for housing supply on board as soon as possible. So what we're proposing is a less linear process. This is a phased and layered approach that sets up tools to help with urgent issues as we go. The layers are divided into one that focuses on implementation and the other on innovation. The implementation layer is more of a technical path. It's setting up and syncing up our regulations. The implementation layer starts with the first phase of setting up the vessel that holds our regulations. That's what we're referring to in this slide as a baseline UDO. It takes on the syncing, clarifying, and correcting of the regs. It will look at the series of land development regulations and bring them together in one consistent set of rules, cleaning up the existing rules. This will help with efficiency and streamlining of review processes sooner in our process. The innovation layer is the space for broad conversations about making larger content changes to the regulations. This focus on innovation involves a standalone audit that builds on affirming community values, provides the research, information gathering, and inspiration for how to tackle the challenges, support our values, and support the mission. This steps helps with alignment of regulations to policy and policy to regulations. The result will be recommendations for ways to modernize the code that is right-sized for this community. This exploration takes time and significant community participation. With the audit process in place, we can move forward with intention. The audit also interfaces with the planning policies. Out of the audit process, we will need to check in on the growth policy to make recommended policy changes and possible land use map changes to set a foundation for content-based changes to come. With the supportive policies and mapping in place through that growth policy update, we work on the next phase of code amendment that focuses on innovation and folds back into the UDO that we've already set up. That's where the integration happens into a second phase of updating the UDO. So deliverables along the way include, first off, having a recommendations report that is a result of the audit and public discussion on the path going forward. Based on that, we can start to craft solutions. Then we also have the technical setting up of the UDO and the first adoption of that complete UDO happening within about 1.5 years from our starting point, we hope. Another deliverable is the adoption of the updated UDO that includes new code innovations at the end of this process. We also need to keep working on those other projects that are urgently helping to address the housing challenges. And that's what I'm showing with the darker green tiles on the bottom of the slide. These are projects that are related and that we are already committed to. We are in the middle of doing a summary growth policy review, and that will help to be able to set up primary goals for this code reform project. We're committed to doing a targeted subdivision regulation amendment that takes especially the most recent state law amendments into consideration. There's a time frame on that is critical for us to consider, and it includes the state law ability to have an expedited subdivision process. So we want to get that on the books as soon as possible again, to help with streamlining of development review processes. There is also commitment that we've been working on related to administrative improvements that Erin has mentioned. And the housing team has begun work on housing incentives program process. And transportation is looking at developing a TDM action plan. So we envision with timing and with coordination that those related projects will make their way into the broader process at various points along the way, depending on what those outcomes are. So next I wanted to just take, I've got 3 more slides here that show you a little bit of a deeper detail on the various tracks involved in these 2 layers. The first is to provide a little more background and detail on what we're thinking of on the UDO track, which is primarily the implementation track. And what kind of things we're thinking would be involved in it. This helps to give us a better sense of what we would be needing from a consultant's perspective as well. So we've already talked about the cleanup and consistency and syncing that baseline would do for us. We want to recognize that we need a strong legal foundation for the work and legal guidance. So that will help us with creating consistent terms and being able to use that as a foundation for all the regulation work. And then we've heard a lot of talk about the idea of a process audit in some of the research that Ben and Neil had done. And I think that aligns with the recommendations report as well. So we've highlighted that component and then wanted to keep a placeholder here for making sure that when we do this code reform that we tackle even older code work that we have that takes us back to sometimes Title 19. And if we can possibly fold that into this, we would love to do it. We think that would simplify review processes. So out of that, you see that relationship back to innovation amendments, and again, that update. The other thing that we want to keep in mind, and we hope that you do too, is that we're not really done when the regulations are done. We also need to make sure we're thinking about applications and any sort of supporting manuals that would be needed to be a part of this process. So I wanted to make a note of that. And then more detail into the innovation track. And this is where there's that interface between innovation with ultimately code, but our starting point in values and policy, and then back to code again. So I'm drilling down on innovation and the audit here, and specifically honing in on that alignment, the recognition that we want to be looking at best urban practices and new approaches, and thinking about our community from the perspective of sustainability and equity as well. And then making sure we're grounded in a good foundation of how projects are financed too. So we're highlighting those components of the track and then recognizing that it makes its way back into an updated code through the slide I was showing you earlier. Just some points of highlights that we know we'd be thinking about when we talk about innovation and content. It might be around the way that we think of placemaking in neighborhoods or neighborhood needs. It might be related to elements that come from other policy documents like transportation. And what more can we do to implement mode split goals? And more recently, streetscape typologies. That might mean that eventually in our content-based, second phase of code amendments, we actually look at street types and roads types a little differently than what we've seen in the past. So those are options and possibilities. And then the last track is that interface with the growth policy. As I mentioned, we're doing the review. You see in this slide that interface between innovation and policy. We want to recognize that state law will guide us also in some new ways that we would look at updating the growth policy. We will be working on our updated data and profile about the community that will inform policy and a growth policy update eventually. And we may contemplate some fiscal analysis tools to be able to provide education and foundation for our decisions. So these are the more specific details on the kinds of things we're thinking of. And that gives you an overview of the process that we have conceptualized. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Erin, and she's going to go through next steps and close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavelle and Ben, for the extensive work that it's clear you've done to get us to this point, for presenting it so well to council. So Lavelle created a slide that briefly works us through some very concrete next steps in this work. As I mentioned, this is just the beginning of our community conversation around code reform, but we do have some very tangible things we need to move towards in the next month or so. A key next step will be to bring this back before council on August 4th as part of our CPDI budget presentation, with a request to fund this work over a 2-year period. We are recognizant of the fact that this is a large budget request. We're asking for $850,000 split between 2 years. And I hope that our team today did an adequate job in expressing the benefit and the sheer necessity of the work before us. This request was developed through careful research and communication, which Ben alluded to, working with both consultant firms that we have relationships with and ones that we don't, as well as cities like ours who have recently engaged in similar efforts. I think it's important as well to be candid about the alternative of doing nothing or continuing to engage in small Band-Aid efforts through annual code updates, which we've done for the last few years. By taking a minimal or a piecemeal approach, as Lavelle mentioned, those goalposts will continue to move on us. We'll make progress in one area and we'll fall further behind in another. Our regulatory work will remain siloed with conflicting codes in Title 20 and Title 12 and other administrative guidelines and processes. And those conflicting codes will continue to create frustration, inefficiencies, and have real impact on development review, which we know slows things down and increase costs to either the eventual renter or homeowner, especially of residential development. We'll also fail to meet the urgency of the moment and to benefit from a comprehensive approach that lines up all of the moving parts, setting us up to achieve the outcomes our community desperately needs. So we want to thank you again for the opportunity to present this information to you and to kickstart this conversation with the community and LUP today. We look forward to continuing the conversation in our budget presentation on August 4th, and the team on the call today would love to take any questions that LUP members have for us.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Erin and Lavelle and Ben, for the presentation. This is really exciting to me. I was thinking a little bit about this budget ask, and I have a feeling that this is ultimately going to pay for itself. It's just not going to be the city that gets reimbursed. It's going to be, ultimately the renters and the home buyers and members of the community that are beneficiaries as we reform our codes. And I think to me, it's really important to note that code reform is not deregulation. It's creating regulations that work for our community. And we've all experienced some of the frustration around codes that are where maybe it feels like we're putting a square peg in a round hole. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here to really just start with a clean slate in a few years here, and codes that are really tailored to the specific needs of our community. So it's an exciting opportunity with some of the funding sources available for large scale community projects. I think that this is a really wise use of funds, and I think that it will that it'll serve us really well in the long run. Looks like I've got a queue of folks lining up. I've got Julie first and then Heather.
Thanks, Erin and Lavelle and Ben for all the work on this. And I do think that this is moving in the right direction. I've got some questions and comments that are maybe a little bit in the weeds, but they're kind of a list of things that have been on my mind. So if the chair doesn't mind, I'm just going to kind of run through all of them.
That's great. Go right ahead.
So a while ago, I had some communications, Erin, with your department about the process of development when and trying to get notice to council members early on when sites are being redeveloped and that are going to result or likely to result in the displacement of existing residents. And so I just want to keep that on the radar screen as something. I don't know if that's out of the scope of this or not. Recently in my ward, there's been a lot of rub with commercial development going in adjacent to existing residential development. And there's been one particular project that has been very painful for those existing folks. So I guess I would just ask that somehow we have some sensitivity when that commercial development is going in up against existing residential. It can be just really disruptive for people's lives. Also, as another example of something that's happened in my ward, and this may be well outside of what we're talking about, but there appears to be a loophole that someone can sneak through whereby an unlicensed individual has been given permits to build commercial building. And I hope somehow in this process that loophole might get closed. I also want to keep the short-term rentals as an item that's on the radar screen for figuring out how we address that, or I guess figuring out, first of all, if it really is an issue that's affecting our housing market, and if it is, how we address it. And then finally, I guess I'm concerned in a bigger picture sense of how we make sure that we're not just reducing the regulations and allowing people who have, money outside of our community coming in and building, especially rentals for profit, that are not helping out the low income people in our community. That's my list. Thanks.
Thank you. And I can just respond to a few things that I heard that that I think we touched on a little bit, but need to draw out further. And one of those is, Lavelle may have mentioned, there are pieces that are big. I think use is one of those, right? Talking about commercial uses and residential uses in a neighborhood, and where is form-based code right? And how do we talk about those things? And I think that is a big conversation and does really belong in a broad effort that has really meaningful community engagement. There are things, though, that we don't need to lump into this broad effort, and we can address on their own. Things like if there's a loophole that's allowing unlicensed contractors to gain building permits, we need to address that now, right? And that doesn't have to be part of a broader effort. But I think you're absolutely right, Councilwoman Merritt, that this has to be a broad conversation, which we articulated. This is not just about code and regulation, and it's absolutely not about deregulation. This is about looking at code and regulation and making sure that code and regulation provides us the tools that we need to achieve our goals. And our goals include conversations about our community values, about a sense of place, about making sure that Missoula is a place where everyone has an opportunity to thrive. And so that is the sentiment that will drive code reform and ensure that this is a community conversation.
Thanks, Erin. I appreciate that.
Thank you both. Julie, do you have additional items on your list?
Not at this time, thanks.
I think your list is actually segues really nicely into sort of a question on process and how we kick this off. So upon the budget adoption, there are going to be a whole bunch of folks who need to provide input into what this process looks like and how we scope it out and how we select consultants and so on. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of the early stages are in this implementation if the budget amendment or if the budget item is approved?
Yeah, and I can talk about one of the key pieces I think that is really important to me and that I'm passionate about, and then I'll turn it over to Lavelle to talk about some of the ideas that they have in terms of staging of this. I think one of the first things that we have to do that Lavelle and her team are committed to is to create that community engagement plan. We have to determine where the intervals for that really meaningful, constant community engagement throughout the process will be, and how we make sure that we're drafting a scope of work that is truly going to lead us to the outcomes that we need at the end of this process. And so I think that is task one. It is determining what that community engagement looks like and making sure that people see a place for themselves through that process. Lavelle, do you have other thoughts?
I think it's really key in how we create that public participation plan and then leave the door open for suggestions from a consultant as well and what they bring into it. Because I think they could look at this path and have some amazing other ideas and suggestions. So we want to make sure that that's there for them. But I think also what we've heard loud and clear, and we know this is really important, is make sure that we set up a process that goes to people and not that just people come to us. So I don't know what that would look like, but it has to be multifaceted. And I think, Jordan, in your question, you talk about how to collect some of those early ideas. And, we could hopefully have a robust website and online presence that allows people to pin ideas, drop ideas, post ideas. But I think important in starting that is laying out that foundation for what we're doing, so we don't from the get-go establish any misconceptions of what's possible and what we're working on. So we need that foundation. Then we need multiple ways to engage, including, I think, our online presence.
Sure, thank you. Next I have Heather.
Thanks, Jordan. Aaron, Lavelle, Ben, and Walter, really appreciate you all coming in today. I have been looking forward to code reform in ways that I guess I dream about, but never thought we would actually get to this point. So the reason I'm excited is because I think, by and large, we have looked at our affordable housing crisis through one of two lenses, either through the restriction of supply or through the potential demise of the quality of life. And we have created basically this binary approach. It's either or. You can have supply or you can have quality of life. And I think what this demonstrates to me today is that we have changed that preposition to the word and, from or to and. So we recognize that we have to address supply as well as that quality of life. And this, I think, really sets us on that course to be able to bring people from differing perspectives and different concerns together to the table. And I admire the work that you've gotten us to this point. I have two questions. Ben, I just want to make sure we're clear about this. The audit in which that you are talking about, at one point you mentioned that we should also audit the process. So which area is this audit going to be focusing? Policy, process, or procedures?
Well, I think it would include a look at our processes in the audit. So it would include standards and processes, probably
Great.
as a combination. Yeah.
Okay, good. I just want to make clear that. And then last but not least, and Aaron, I think the question is to you. Something of this caliber is going to upset the apple cart, if you will. And there are going to be people that are going to oppose this movement forward. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what you plan to do to make sure you invite those opposition forces to the table so that we can get buy-in as early on in the engagement process as we can.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think to me, it goes back to engagement that is meaningful, right? That we aren't just inviting people from all walks of life and on all sides of the issue, the opportunity to submit a comment, but we're providing people the opportunity to meaningfully engage in the process. And like Lavelle expertly mentioned, we have some ideas about that. But we aren't experts in that either. And so we're really eager to talk with others, to hear from consultants about best practices and ways to do that. I think the city has made great strides in our engagement in the past couple of years. We also have a long way to go to really engage our residents in ways that are meaningful and consistent, not just on an issue by issue or initiative by initiative basis, but throughout the course of multiple efforts that impact neighborhoods or impact people's lives in ways that are meaningful to them. And so I think that is our goal. And it doesn't mean that at the end of this process that everyone will be happy with the outcome. But what it will mean, our goal is that at the end of this process, everyone will say, I had an opportunity to engage and my feedback was heard and my feedback was incorporated.
Appreciate that very much. And one last comment. A couple of weeks ago, your Deputy Director, Montana James, was sitting in a conversation that I was at the table at, and she mentioned a book called The Affordable City by Shane Phillips. I picked that up just last week, Friday, cracked it open, and it really is just chock full, if you will, of what you're talking about today and really changing the conversation to and. I highly encourage my colleagues around this table to purchase that book too, and if nothing else, read the appendix in the back and read the foreword. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. There's no one else with a hand up. Does anyone else have any questions? I know Stacey Anderson's here, and Stacey, I apologize. I don't know if how long you've been here, but welcome. Okay. I don't see any other questions. This is a big thing, so there will certainly be questions along the way. This is a great introduction, and I'm really excited, and I'm looking forward to this hopefully moving through the budget process, being part of the budget, and being able to launch this process. Mirta.
Thanks. I've been thinking as you were presenting that first of all, I think that the uses, the density, intensity, I'm sure they will be, but I think we need to be really specific about ensuring that they happen in coordination with transportation projects and investments that we're making in the community so that they can really benefit the community to its fullest potential. So that would be, I guess, my thought is that we make a coordinated effort to ensure that those two areas of growth in the community are compatible and you know, aligning well. And I also was thinking about community engagement and how for a long time, a dream of mine has been that we create a multi-layer database that can be available through the neighborhood's office so that anyone in the community, any neighbor can have access to this database where they can see what is happening in their community and the best way to get more information and participate. So if this process at all intersects with that potential vision, I know we have all that information, but I know that it takes a lot of staff time to put it all together in a format that is easy to consume by our citizens. But if there's a way to integrate that into this work, I think would be super beneficial. Just 2 cents.
We have similar dreams. So I've been researching how to create those neighborhood profiles and share more information on a neighborhood level. Lavelle and her team and Colin Woodrow, our neighborhoods coordinator, have really been doing a lot of work and dreaming around that as well. And so we hope to keep moving in that direction. And just to follow up, on Jordan's comments. We are really excited to keep having this conversation. We will be back before you on August 4th, and we would really encourage any council members to reach out to us in the interim if there are things you either want to talk about in between now and that session, or if there's something you'd like to put on our radar to come prepared to talk about at that August 4th meeting. That will give us some time to make sure that we can adequately address your questions.
Okay, great. I don't see any further questions. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, seeing none. Again, we don't have any public attendees, so we won't have any public comment. And without anything further, we can be adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.